The streets lay silent beneath a blanket of snow, lit faintly by Christmas lights strung along rooftops. Each colorful bulb flickered with a life of its own, casting shadows that danced on the icy pavement. James shuffled home, his breath visible in the crisp winter air, the crunch of his boots echoing in the emptiness. It was late, and he was tired from his shift at the diner. Christmas was days away, but the usual cheer felt muted this year, like something was waiting for an order to get to work. As James turned the corner to his street, he spotted someone standing under the broken street lamp just ahead. They were unnaturally still, their form partially obscured by the swirling snow. "Evening," James called out, his voice cracking through the silence. The figure didn't respond, didn't even twitch. Their black coat and top hat seemed out of place, too formal, too old-fashioned. James quickened his pace, eyes fixed on the stranger. As he passed, the figure's face remained hidden in shadow, and James couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching him, even as he turned the key to his front door and stepped inside. That evening, James tried to push the encounter from his mind. He poured himself a cup of cocoa and settled onto the couch, surrounded by the warmth of Christmas decorations. The tree stood proudly in the corner, its lights twinkling cheerfully. But as he reached for the remote, a flicker of movement caught his eye. The window. James turned toward the frosted glass, his heart skipping a beat. Outside, amidst the falling snow, stood the same figure. It was closer this time, just beyond the fence, its head tilted unnaturally, as though listening. James' throat tightened. The figure didn't move, didn't leave footprints in the fresh snow. James tried to rationalize what he'd seen, but his nerves were frayed. He locked the doors, checked the windows twice, and even turned on an old Christmas movie to drown out the unease. Hours passed, and he began to relax. Until the knocking began. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of the TV. James muted the film, straining to listen. The knock came again, soft but rhythmic, like a melody. He froze as the pattern became clear. It was Silent Night, tapped out slowly on the glass. James approached the door with trepidation, his hands trembling. He peered through the peephole, but no one was there. The knocking stopped. He stepped back, heart pounding, when a creak sounded from upstairs. His blood ran cold. Someone, or something, was inside. James grabbed a flashlight and made his way up the stairs, the old wood groaning under his weight. The sound grew louder, leading him to the attic door. He pushed it open, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The air was icy, and a layer of frost coated the floor. In the center of the room sat an old music box, its gears turning on their own, playing the same haunting tune. James approached cautiously, his breath visible in the freezing air. As he reached out to close the box, the lid snapped shut with a force that made him jump. The room fell silent, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. Desperate for answers, James rummaged through the attic, uncovering an old box of photographs. Among them was a black and white image of a group of carolers standing outside a church. Their faces were blurred, as if the camera had failed to capture them properly. But behind them stood the figure, a tall, shadowy presence, with a twisted grin just visible beneath its hat. James flipped the photo over. Written in faded ink were the words, "The Silent Caroler, 1896. Beware his song." Detective fiction writer and author of the James Perkin novels. The air grew heavier as James returned to the living room. He locked every door, every window, and sat clutching his phone, debating whether to call someone. Then, the lights flickered. James looked up to see the figure inside, standing just beyond the Christmas tree. It was taller than he remembered. its skeletal hands reaching out as it stepped closer. "Will you sing with me?" it whispered, its voice low and melodic. James tried to scream, but the words caught in his throat. The room seemed to spin, the walls closing in as the figure loomed over him. The next morning, neighbors found James's house eerily silent. The front door was ajar, snow drifting into the entryway. Inside, the Christmas tree stood untouched, its lights still twinkling. James was gone, with no sign of a struggle. The only clue left behind was a single ornament lying on the floor, its surface cracked, reflecting the flickering lights. Outside, the snow was pristine, except for a single trail of footprints leading away from the house. Footprints that vanished halfway down the street. Some songs are better left unsung. This Christmas, if you hear a melody in the silence, don't follow it. The silent caroler is always looking for his next voice. It was Christmas Eve, and the small town of Millfield lay deathly still under a suffocating blanket of snow. The streets were devoid of life, the only sound the relentless howling of the wind as it clawed at the darkened houses. The festive lights that lined rooftops and trees flickered intermittently, as though struggling against the weight of the storm. Inside her aging Victorian home, Evelyn sat in silence. This year, the weight of solitude pressed heavily on her shoulders. Her husband had passed 2 years ago, and now her children were miles away, busy with their own families. She had tried to fill the void, decorating her tree with ornaments from years past, lighting candles to mask the creeping shadows of her empty home. But the silence remained unshakable. She sat in her armchair by the fire, staring out into the swirling snowstorm. The world outside was eerily still, as though it had stopped breathing. As the clock in the hallway chimed midnight, the oppressive quiet was shattered by a sharp knock at the door. Evelyn's heart leapt, her teacup rattling against its saucer. She froze, staring at the door as if it might leap off its hinges. Who would be out in this weather? And at this hour? The knock came again, louder this time, resonating through the walls of the old house. Evelyn stood, her slippers brushing softly against the wooden floor as she moved toward the door. Through the frosted glass pane, she could just make out the silhouette of a figure standing on her porch, the snowstorm swallowing their features. Her voice trembled as she called out, "Who's there? I'm sorry to bother you," came the muffled reply. It was a man's voice, low and calm, almost too calm. "My car broke down up the road. I've been walking for hours. Please, may I come in to warm up?" Evelyn hesitated, her hand lingering on the latch. Something about the voice felt wrong. It was polite, even gentle, but it carried a weight she couldn't explain, a heaviness that seeped into her bones. She peered again through the glass, but the figure remained indistinct, cloaked in shadow and snow. "Please," the man repeated. His voice was closer now, as if he had leaned toward the door. "It's so cold." Against her better judgment, Evelyn unlatched the door and opened it just enough to let the man step inside. He was tall, his features gaunt and pale, with dark circles under his eyes. Snow clung to his long coat, and his breath curled in the air like smoke. "Thank you," he said softly, though his voice seemed to echo strangely, as if the words were spoken in a larger, emptier space. He stepped into the warmth, his presence immediately making the room feel colder. Evelyn closed the door, her hands trembling. "You can warm up by the fire," she said, her voice faltering. The man nodded, but as he moved into the living room, his steps made no sound on the wooden floor. He removed his coat and scarf, revealing an old, threadbare sweater. His movements were slow, deliberate, as though he were unused to the weight of his body. Evelyn disappeared into the kitchen to prepare tea, her heart racing. When she returned, she found him standing by the fire, staring into the flames. His back was to her, and for a moment she could have sworn his shadow on the wall moved independently, its edges twisting and flickering unnaturally. They sat across from each other, the stranger sipping his tea in silence. Evelyn tried to make polite conversation, asking about his car and how long he'd been walking. But his answers were vague, his gaze never quite meeting hers. As the minutes passed, Evelyn began to notice strange things. The room felt colder now, despite the fire burning brightly. The lights on the Christmas tree flickered more frequently, casting unsettling patterns on the walls. "You have a lovely home," the man said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. His eyes drifted to the photographs on the mantelpiece, pictures of Evelyn's children and late husband. So full of memories. Evelyn's stomach churned. She hadn't mentioned her family. "How do you know that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man smiled faintly, his expression unreadable. "I've always known, Evelyn. You've lived a long life, haven't you? Filled with love and loss." Evelyn's hands trembled as she set her teacup down. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice cracking. The man leaned forward, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. "I'm here to remind you," he said softly. "Remind you of what you've forgotten. You've spent so much time dwelling on the absence of those you love, but you don't see the truth." Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest. "What truth?" The man's smile widened, but it was hollow, his teeth too white, too perfect. "That love doesn't disappear when life does. It lingers, Evelyn. But so does pain. So does regret. You've invited it in, just as you've invited me." A cold wind suddenly swept through the room, extinguishing the fire. Evelyn gasped, clutching the armrest of her chair. The man's shadow grew, stretching across the walls, its edges sharp and jagged like broken glass. Evelyn shut her eyes, her breath coming in shallow gasps. When she opened them, the room was silent again. The fire crackled back to life, the tree lights steadied, and the man was gone. Patty said. His coat and scarf were no longer draped over the chair, and the teacup he had been holding sat untouched on the table. Evelyn glanced toward the window, but the snow outside was pristine, with no footprints leading away from her door. Her hands shook as she whispered his name, though she hadn't realized she knew it. The next morning, Evelyn awoke to find a small package on the mantel, wrapped in aged, fraying paper. Inside was a delicate glass ornament, an angel with hollow, staring eyes. Though she couldn't explain what had happened, she felt a chilling certainty that her visitor had been no ordinary man. From that day forward, Evelyn kept the ornament, its presence a reminder of the lingering specters of love, loss, and the unknowable forces that haunt even the brightest of holidays.